Aloha, everyone, and welcome to Civil Beat's Ideas Live show for Wednesday, April 7th, 2021. We're very happy to have you with us for this next hour. We're having a show today about housing in Singapore, and we're joined by two very distinguished guests from Singapore. It's 8 in the morning on Thursday in Singapore, and we're so grateful that one of the most esteemed, perhaps the most esteemed architects in Singaporean history is here with us today. The architect of modern Singapore, Dr. Liu Thai Ker, is here. And we also have with us Professor Sock-Yong Phang, and from Hawaii, we have Hawaii's own State Senator Stanley Chang. So just a little bit about our guests. Professor Phang is a Harvard-trained economist who's currently a professor of economics at Singapore's Management University. Senator Stanley Chang is a representative from the 9th District of East Oahu and is chair of the Hawaii State Senate's Housing Committee. And Dr. Liu Thai Ker has really a remarkable life story and a remarkable history. He's 83. He first moved to Singapore with his family following the end of World War II. He'd intended to become an artist like his father, but he became an architect instead. He came from very humble beginnings, but he won assistance to travel to Australia and enroll in the architectural program at the University of New South Wales in 1962. He was the top student there, traveled to Yale University in the United States in 1965 and was a top student again there in architecture, went to work with I.M. Pei in New York. And then when Singapore was expelled from Malaysia in 1965, he decided that he wanted to return to the very new nation and to really become part of the fate of Singaporeans, specifically looking at their housing. He went to work for the government's Housing and Urban Development Board. He rose to become the head of the Housing and Development Board. He was instrumental, as we'll hear about today, in creating housing for hundreds of thousands of Singaporean and for creating and devising a really innovative model for housing, which is really the point of our discussion today. After 20 years, he with the Housing and Urban Development Board, he left, he became the chief planner for Singapore from 1988 to 1992 and wrote the planning document that is still used today, the foundational document, and then went into private practice and now has worked in planning all over Asia and even in other parts of the world too. And at the age of 79, he went into private practice and set up his own firm. So we're so grateful to have you here with us today, Dr. Liu. And we love to start these shows by learning a little bit about our guests. And since our topic today is housing, because housing is so fundamental to who we are as individuals, and shelter is so essential and so formative, I thought that I would love to begin today's show by asking you each to tell us about the housing that you grew up in. When you were a young person, what sort of environment were you living in? What was the housing like that you lived in? So, Dr. Liu, would you start by telling us a little bit about the housing that you grew up in and how you feel it influenced you and your life?
Sure. Well, I actually grew up in Malaysia, about 120 kilometers from Singapore. And my grandparents were relatively comfortable, not rich, poor, but comfortable. So we lived in a properly built house, but surrounded by vegetable farms and jungles and so on. So from a very young age, I was kind of comfortable with nature, surrounded by turkeys, chickens, ducks, and so on. They became my playmate. So that was my childhood. Then after the war, we came to Singapore, and Singapore in those days, even as late as 1960, 65, we were considered one of the most backward countries in Asia. In fact, we were clearly behind Manila, behind Ho Chi Minh City, behind Yangon. And therefore, although we lived in a kind of brick house, but the condition there was very poor. We didn't have flush toilets. We had to use buckets and so on. So that was an environment I grew up with. And therefore, when I went to Australia and I saw not only I saw that the housing in condition was very good, that was one of the things that amazed me was how elegant and beautiful were the toilet papers. Because in Singapore, we use newspaper for toilet paper. That's a kind of, and therefore that kind of first impression just gave me a strong desire that when I became an architect, I would like to do something to help the Singaporeans to lead a better life. That was a motivation.
All right, that's wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Phang, can you tell us a little bit about what the housing was like when you were a girl for you?
Well, I grew up in actually rental public housing that was built by the British colonial government in the 1950s. And these were 9-story blocks at the doorstep of the CBD and Chinatown. And at that point in 1950s and 60s, 9 stories was considered tall when compared to all the surrounding shop houses that blanketed Chinatown. And I therefore had a bird's eye view of the tremendous work that Dr. Liu and his team did to resettle the entire population of Chinatown and redevelop the city to what it is today. So, well, I live in a very urban environment growing up and was so used to all the amenities and facilities that were literally at the doorstep of the development. Well, the blocks have since been demolished. There's now much taller commercial buildings there. So that was the environment where I grew up in when Singapore was going through all these tremendous changes just before independence and after independence.
Okay, thank you. And Senator Chang, how about you?
I grew up in the house that I'm in right now, which is a single family house here in East Honolulu, probably built in the same era that Professor Phang was talking about in the 1950s. And growing up, it was probably fairly typical for suburban Honolulu. But I also spent a lot of time with family and relatives in Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. And of course, that's where you have the super dense, super walkable, transit-oriented type of communities where people did not need cars to get around. And, you know, we're within a 5-minute walk of every conceivable service, whether it's a grocery store or bank or pharmacy or post office. And that really helped to open my eyes that the suburban sprawl that we have is not the only way that housing can be here in Hawaii and in the United States generally.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. So, Dr. Liu, I would love to begin the discussion really by sort of, if I could ask you to go back to those early years when Singapore was newly independent and when you had just come back and you were working at the Housing and Urban Development Board, what was, as you begin to create the housing system that exists in Singapore to this day, if you could tell our viewers a little bit about the parameters of that system and what was motivating you to design it in the way that you did?
Okay, I would certainly answer the question, but before we do so, I thought we would just break the ice a bit by saying that comparing Singapore and Hawaii, Singapore today has 4 times the population size of Hawaii, but Hawaii has 13 times the land size of Singapore. So that's so Singapore is highly density area, and even Honolulu. You see, our city now has 5.8 million people, and Honolulu has about 1 million, I think. So there's a big kind of contrast in terms of density. But personally, I feel that despite the big contrast in density, a sound planning theory is applicable anywhere. Because I always tell people that a sound planning theory is like the grammar of the language. If you master the grammar of the language, you can tell any story anywhere of any length. And the sound planning theory is applicable. I thought I would just help each other understand that there's a big difference between the two places, and yet we can still find a common ground to share each other's experience. Now, Singapore, in 1960, when the British pulled out, we were considered one of the most backward countries, cities in Asia. We were behind Manila, behind Ho Chi Minh City, behind Yangon. And how do I explain that? At that time, we have 1.6 million people, and 3 out of 4 people lived in squatter huts, 3 out of 4. But because of public housing, within 25 years, by 1985, we achieved the following 4 statements. 1, no more squatters. We clear all of them. 2, no homeless. Everyone in Singapore had a home. 3, no ghettos, because our public housing policy is handled by only one agency, Housing and Development Board. So we took the trouble to mix the different income groups together. So when it comes to Singapore now, you can't find ghettos. They're all kind of decent living environment. And 4, no ethnic enclaves. That means we have Chinese, Malay, Indians, and of course Caucasians, and they are now all mixed together. You don't have kind of Chinese living in one corner, Malay living now. We don't have that. So this, to me, is quite a major achievement. And on top of that, 80% of our people live in public housing today. But for the whole of Singapore, over 90% of people in Singapore own their own homes. That's also a world record. And how do we do that? A lot of people give the credit to me and call me the father of public housing. I totally refuse to accept that. Why? Because I could not have done anything for what I've just said to you without a good political leaders who cared about the people and the land. And of course, among them, the most important one is Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, our first Prime Minister. You see, a lot of political leaders would like to build iconic projects, sensational projects that get publicized in the media. But Mr. Lee, despite the fact I was in touch with him several times a year for a couple of decades, he never once mentioned he wanted an iconic building, never once. All the time he talked to me about how to improve the livelihood, the living condition of people, and 2, how to improve the environment of the land. It's people and land. Not one word about iconic building. But despite the fact he did not talk about iconic buildings, personally, I feel that if the political leader care for people and land, he will build an iconic city that's even more impressive. And I think maybe that's why a lot of people, when they come to Singapore, they like Singapore, even though they cannot pinpoint on too many iconic architecture, but the city itself is iconic. I want to emphasize that good political leadership with a sound policy makes a big difference. But still, another thing I appreciate about Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his colleagues is they only told me what they want. They never told me once about how I should do things. They left the how entirely to the civil servants, including me. And therefore, I had to develop my planning skill and try to find out how to put the city together. And therefore, I told myself, as a planner and architect, I must position myself as a servant of the land and people, not a master of the land and people. So the job was to find out what were the fundamental living needs of the people. What are the needs of the land for the land to be functional and for the environment to be ecologically sustainable. So this is kind of a broad picture. I would like to just give you a sense of understanding how Singapore got its job done.
And that is such a valuable overview. And I wonder if we could, when you talk about the fact that this was accomplished by 1985, that you achieved no more squatters, no homeless, no ghettos, and this ethnic, no sense of any ethnic enclaves. Can you talk to us a little bit about what, if the how was left to you, how did you do it? Can you tell us a little bit about how you actually accomplished this?
Yes, in the beginning it was tough because I joined Housing and Development Board in 1969, coming back from America. And during the first 2 weeks, I was a kind of a middle-ranking officer at that time. Everybody in public house, in HDB, Housing and Development Board, talked about new towns and neighborhoods. And I asked them, I said, what is a new town? What is a neighborhood? None of them could tell me. So then I went up to see my chief executive officer, who was an architect too. I said, tell me what is a new town, what is a neighborhood? He shook his head. He said, I also don't know. I said, wonderful, I'll find out for you. So actually it took me about 2 years to interview people, interview businessmen, interview residents, interview sociologists, interview the local grassroots leaders, and then created, the concept of new town came from Europe. The concept of highly self-sustainable new town came from Europe, but you can't find any book to tell you the quantification of this, how to create a new town. So after 2 years, I came up with a Singapore quantifiable urban model. That means a new town must have a minimum population size of around 200,000 people. And because when you have that, you can sustain so many basic living necessities, shops, schools, clinics, and so on. And also you can support, you have enough population to support some clean industry. And so this is kind of a model that I've created after 2 years, but that's not the end of it. Because I also, as a young man, I also was struck by a statement from the West saying that a city is but a gallery of portraits. That means people live there, they don't belong to each other. I said, well, how can we create a sense of community? So then I proceeded to break the new towns down to neighborhoods, but then I also realized that people could not relate emotionally to a neighborhood. So then after consulting a lot of people, we broke the neighborhood down to precinct. Precinct is like 10 acres, roughly. So now in Singapore, we build public housing projects precinct by precinct, but the precinct fits nicely into a neighborhood with a neighborhood center. And we make sure that the neighborhood center, given the density that we have, we managed to achieve a neighborhood with a walking radius of about 500 meters. So people can walk to neighborhood center, walk to the primary school, walk to the secondary school. But then if you cannot get what you want in neighborhood center, you go to town center. That, of course, you need to go by bicycle or by car or buses and so on. So this kind of new town prototype, it took me about 2 years to develop, but in the 20 years in HDB, I continue to, with the help of all my colleagues, with the help of 12 sociologists with PhD degree to advise me, we continue to polish up the new town model. So in fact, a lot of people like to ask me to say, which new town is my favorite one? The answer is obvious, the latest one. Okay, it's a long answer to your short question.
No, but you're always refining it. That makes sense. But so that's wonderful in giving us a sense of what was driving you conceptually and how that evolved. And then can you tell us a little bit about just the specifics of the actual creation of the new towns themselves, and what type of scale are we talking about? You mentioned 1985 as a sort of a point of reference. By 1985, how many units had you created, or had the Housing and Urban Development Board created?
Well, I would say between 1969 and 1989, when I left HDB in 20 years, I personally oversaw the planning of 20 new towns, each about 200,000 or more, 200,000 to 300,000 people. Two, I oversaw the creation of the public housing prototypes, the studio apartment, one-bedroom apartment, and so on. There are 5 prototypes. And I did not allow any architect, including myself, to do the floor plan of the prototype. Every amendment to the prototype must be the result of a roundtable discussion based on the feedback we got. How do we get the feedback? You see, Housing Development Board actually gave me an ideal urban laboratories, because what we had to do was to plan, to design, to build, and the most valuable part is to manage the properties. When you manage the properties, you get lots of complaints. Now, there are 2 ways to deal with the complaint. One is to throw the complaint into the rubbish dump, but we organized 4 or 5 research groups, engineers, architects, property managers, sociologists, to see through the complaints. And of course, 99% complaint is rubbish, but that 1% is gem. They'll tell you the flaws of our previous work, ideas that we had not thought of. So this would then be plowed back to the next round of work. And we did that for 20 years. I did that for 20 years. And I think what is very important is that when you look about building, you think about the hardwares. But I had the benefit of getting to know the sociologists very early on when I was in public housing. So I realized that it's very, very important to get the advice of sociologists to create a sense of community, a sense of belonging, a sense of nostalgia, a sense of patriotism, and all these things. So this kind of research through my urban laboratory gave me really a very body of knowledge that I feel that it's not just applicable to Singapore, it's applicable anywhere in the world. That's why at this ripe old age, I'm still working to share my experience.
Yeah.
Looking towards Hawaii too.
Well, we're very, very grateful to be able to hear what you've done. What I'd love to do at this point is to talk a little bit about the economics of how it all works. And Dr. Liu, if you wanted to speak to this, Professor Pang, perhaps both of you. But my understanding is that when someone purchases one of the units in public housing, they purchase a 99-year lease. And that's what constitutes ownership. And that is can be bought and sold. But so if it would be wonderful if you could explain for our viewers a little bit more just about the parameters of the also the savings accounts that people get through the government that help them to purchase units, and just how the money works. And would you like to start with that one, Dr. Liu?
Yes, I will. But before that, I go back to one question you asked earlier: is how many buildings I built? Okay, between 1969 and 89, under my supervision, I built 500,000 units of flats. I'm thinking of putting myself into the Guinness Book of Records. But of course, today in Singapore, we have 1.3 million units of public housing.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the finance of public housing is also, I would say, the credit must go to the Singapore government, because, as I mentioned earlier, we were a desperately poor country, and but our political leader was determined we have to solve the housing problem, because at that time when we became an independent country in 1965, our political leader was that scared of the survival of the city, of the country, because it's such a small country with almost no resources. Mm-hmm. And how do we survive? And we're so poor. So they actually did a lot of debate within the cabinet and identified certain key policies. One, of course, is public housing, because they felt that for us to become a good workplace, we must have people who can live comfortably without worrying about where to live. Then they can focus their mind on their work. And number two is that at that time, a Chinese will look to China as his own country. India will look to India as his own country. So the government was concerned that we might not have a sense of nationhood. That's why, as early as 1964, we already introduced selling the public housing to have a kind of home ownership. Because if you have ownership of a piece of property in your country, then if there's a war, you will fight for your life to save your properties. So this public housing, the impact of that is beyond just housing. But of course, housing itself is very, very important. And since we are so desperate, we would then to say that we have to find a way to self-sustain the public housing, because in those days we didn't even have enough money to borrow money or to pay back. So the economic formula is really brilliant. That what I want to say is that we did not build housing, we built community. That's very important. Why I use the word community? Because when we build housing, we build shops, we build factories, and we build clinics and so on. So when you build shops, on the one hand, it provides facilities to the resident, but at the same time, it creates jobs. When you create jobs, it means that the government has revenue from the income tax of the shopkeepers, revenues from the income tax of the residents, and similarly for industry. So it's creating a kind of positive circle, yeah. So that despite the fact the government every year subsidize the HDB to keep our rental and our costs low, but the government, on the other hand, has other kind of income. It's a very, I would say, very clever formula, and to help the people pay for the rent or the purchase of public housing, we had the Central Provident Fund. The Central Provident Fund is compulsory. It's a compulsory saving scheme, and it's pretty hectic because the government, as our income level got better and better, the government kept increasing the percentage of contribution of Central Provident Fund higher and higher. Today, if you earn $1,000, the employer has to top up another $140 to your fund. You have to deduct $140 into the fund. So it's like 28%. And so that makes it possible for people to pay for their homes, despite the fact there's still subsidy. So it's a very clever economic formula. Yeah. But I would say that behind the economic formula, a very important concept is we did not just build housing, we built community. And we did not build just public housing as a temporary measure. Every building we built is meant to last for centuries. It's a permanent structure.
I ask you, David, there's so many different things that you've said that we could, and I hope that we will explore further, but what was it that led you to make the decision that ownership should be structured to be a 99-year lease? Why that instead of simple?
That is, again, not my credit. I wish I could claim it. It's Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his cabinets, because in his own word, because I used to see him about 7 or 8 times a year, quite often one-to-one over lunch. And he explained to me that he introduced the 99-year lease because he feared that Singapore being such a small place, and in those days, in the 60s and 70s, we have a kind of baby boom. In fact, our growth rate in those days was 4.8% per year. It's now it's like 2 point something, under 2, but in those days 4. There was a concern that if we have freehold, and when we run short of land and we need land to build more housing, we can't find the land. So 99 years means that if we need land, at the end of 99 years, we can take back the properties and then pull down the properties and build more structures. But I think that was a very, everything we did in those days was for long term. We looked far into the future. And also everything we did was to solve the root cause of a problem, not the symptoms of a problem. I think these are also very important lessons we can learn from what we did in the early days. And I think a lot of credit must go to the political leaders.
Yeah, well, it's very fascinating the way you describe that the way in which one's sense of being a Singaporean, one's sense of citizenship was allied with this idea that if you were a citizen, then you deserved shelter. You were a part of community, and as part of being a part of community, there would be housing for you.
Yes.
So, Professor Phang, I'd love to bring you in here to talk maybe a little more about the economics of it. And if you could explain so that the viewers really understand, in the United States, typically, if you want a home, you have to go to a bank and hope that you will qualify for a loan. how does it work with the Central Provident Fund that Dr. Liu was mentioning? And in what ways does it differ in Singapore?
But I think for home ownership to work, and for the demand for home ownership to be there, the housing finance system is so critical. And so when HDB was building at a very rapid rate, HDB also need to be funded, because if the HDB was a rental model, the burden of financing the whole HDB will fall on the taxpayers and government budgeting. So I think the Central Provident Fund was a way to what we would describe as mobilization of domestic savings towards home ownership and financing the entire housing framework. So I think the Housing Provident Fund model actually was actually a very innovative policy at a point in time in 1968, when the Central Provident Fund, the pension scheme, was converted partially into a Housing Provident Fund. And then when the contribution rates were increased, it enabled the housing finance to take off and home ownership to take off. So various other countries have come to Singapore also to learn about this particular housing finance system. I mean, the US has their own housing finance system where you go to the bank. But here, the households are actually taking their loans from the HDB. So the HDB functions as both a mortgage bank as well as a provider of housing. So it is, to extend, a very comprehensive system where all the links on the supply side and the demand side are actually being put into the HDB, because there was market failure then. There were no banks willing to lend for low-income housing. There were no suppliers for low-income housing. So you could say the government stepped in with a HDB solution. And in terms of the flow of funds, the Central Provident Fund was actually adapted to provide housing finance. So I think Mexico, Brazil, other countries actually adopted the Housing Provident Fund system. And that is a situation where the banks are not willing to lend for low-income housing. I mean, over time, with Singapore's development, there is less of a need for this kind of, you can say, extreme solution. So the banks are coming now, they're very happy to lend for housing, even HDB housing. So the HDB share of having to provide mortgage loans for households have declined from, I think, close over 50% of mortgage lending was done by the HDB to now less than 20% of mortgage lending is done by HDB. So the commercial banks have come into that space. They're very happy to be in that space. And in terms of Central Provident Fund savings, it's now become diversified into not just housing, but for education, for Medicare, and for, of course, retirement. So it's another social security system that we have in place that is through the Central Provident Fund. So we have basically adopted very different solutions from the US, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it sounds like it. All right. Well, thanks for laying that out for us. You know, we've been getting a number of questions from our viewers, and I'd love to bring some of these in. This one would be one for you, I think, Dr. Liu. This is from Alan, and he's asking, how did you avoid corruption by those in charge of the land development?
Well, we have a CPIB, which everybody fears, Corrupt Practice Investigation Bureau, from the beginning. And they did a very good job in catching corrupt practice. And therefore, nobody, I would say that they did a very effective job. So it's difficult to really corrupt. But at the same time, I want to say there's also a push factor, and that is because in those days, almost every second day in the press would say about the fear of our country not being able to survive, the crisis mentality. That drives the sense of patriotism. So everybody that I worked with in the civil service were really totally dedicated to build the country. And the third thing that's in everybody's mind is in search of excellence, because we knew that we were so backward and we might not survive. Therefore, for us to do anything, we have to go for the best we know in the world. So these were kind of key driving forces to help us build the country. Yeah. And also there was very strong collaboration among the civil service. We could just make a call to other departments and say, well, I've got this problem. Can we sit down and talk about it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think the politicians' contribution is important. A very good, positive bureaucracy's working culture is also very important.
Okay. You know, some of the people who have been sending in comments are questioning how much the great successes that you've achieved in Singapore actually really apply to Hawaii. And I think Dr. Liu, at the beginning, you talked about how some of the successes are really unique to Singapore and others really are models that could potentially work anywhere. So one of the questions that I was hoping that we could discuss today is, when you think about thinking as an architect and going back to that idea of the housing that you each lived in, and that idea of housing as a sort of a fundamental component of life, when you think about what you feel are the essential elements that make for good housing, that make for humane housing, that it really doesn't matter where in the world you are, but this is what good, humane, decent housing contains. What does it need to have? What are the things that, whether it was in Singapore or in Honolulu or anywhere in the world, what would you, if you sat down at a table, say, we've got to have this?
The last question. Can you repeat the last question?
Sure. If you were starting out to design housing, regardless of where it was in the world, what are the essential elements that you feel all good, humane housing needs to include?
Well, first of all, the internal layout must be designed to be a comfortable place, workable, and a sense of belonging. In fact, for example, when we designed the housing, we took great care on where to put the kitchen, how wide should the kitchen be, where should be the living room and the dining room, and also how do you keep a better acoustical segregation between neighbors, because of the high density and the building, the units are so packed, we still want to make sure that you don't get the noises from the neighbors. And also, where would be the best place to put the altar in the honor of the gods and so on. All these things were considered when we did the apartment design. That's why I did not allow myself nor any of my architects to do the apartment design. It has to be a collective effort to put all these things into consideration. But that is just a basic home unit. But on top of that, because in the beginning, when this is about a sense of belonging, a sense of security. In the beginning, we put this as so-called slab block, it's just a long slab, and with a very, very long corridor. And therefore, there was a fear of a lack of privacy, because your apartment, people can just, dozens of people can walk by your front doors. So after, again, receiving this kind of complaint and talking to sociologists, and I was advised that it would be nice if a home can have 5 to 6 neighbors so that you don't feel alone. But more than that, you can't cope. So we broke the long corridors into segments of 6 or 8. So when you live in your apartment, you have 5 to 7 neighbors to interact with. So you have both the privacy as well as a sense of security, a sense of living in a community and not totally alone. So, I mean, then this concept is extended to larger and larger areas. So you see, therefore, I actually tell people that to design a good, create a new good plan or design a good community, you need 3 things. You need the humanist heart to care for the people and to care for the environment, the physical environment. 2, you must have a scientist head. The scientist head is to create the living environment like a machine for living. So you must know all the parts in the machine, the dimension of the machine, of the parts, the number of parts you need, and the way you put them together, machine for living. The third is that a living environment is still a work of art. So you must have the eye of an artist to romance with the land. So humanist heart, scientist head, artist eyes. All these things go into the individual flat design, into the block design, into the precinct plan and design, and so on. I can go on and tell you, every little detail is a result of deliberation. In fact, I often tell people that my biggest talent is that I don't allow myself to believe that I have any talent at all.
Mm-hmm. I understand that. Yeah. I'd love to ask you again, just at the human scale, in general, Dr. Liu, over the years, what did people tell you that they liked about the housing you were created and that they didn't like? What did you hear? I mean, you've shared with us a little bit, but were there other things that came up that people said, yeah, you really got this right? Or, well, you know, I'm not sure about that.
Actually, I don't really hear much or any negative feedback from the people who live inside, because we actually create, first of all, the environment that we created is much better than the environment they lived in squatters or in the slum area. But I would say the only criticism that I often get is that the building blocks are so similar, so there is no variety. You know, it looks like just the city becomes very uninteresting. And I personally do not agree with that, not because of self-defense, because in fact, some of the cities that I love a lot in the world, like Jerusalem, all the old Jerusalem, the buildings are identical. It's just one big piece of artwork. Mm. And you go to Chester in UK, everyone is the same. Every building is the same. It's just one big piece of artwork. And I can go on in Italy, Turin, I love Turin a lot. They're all, so cities with high degree of similarity doesn't mean it's bad. But what makes a difference? So I ask myself, because I have no choice but to build them with minimum or even no decoration. It's just bare bones, so keep the cost low, to keep the selling price affordable. Mm-hmm. Then the question, how can I make it beautiful despite the severe budget control? And after thinking for a couple of years, I found the inspiration. Can you guess what it is?
I would guess nature and trees, but I don't really know.
The inspiration came from Miss Universe. You know, all the women in the world have exactly the same eyes and the nose. What makes a Miss Universe different from other ladies? I would say there's only one answer: proportion. So actually, I spend a lot of time making sure that the building facade has nice proportion. And also I introduced the concept of street architecture. That means the arrangement of the building blocks from one street corner to another street corner, you treat it as one facade with variations and so on, so that it doesn't look like products from a factories. So if you just care about the proportion, in fact, you can create more beautiful buildings than decorated, because I've seen many buildings anywhere in the world that is with full of decoration and yet ugly because the proportion is ugly.
Mhm.
So Miss Universe is my inspiration.
Okay, all right. Here is a question that's come in from Donna, and this could be either for you, Dr. Liu, or for you, Professor Phang. How does Singapore prevent speculation?
Speculation.
You know,
We
and
have
I
a
guess
lot of measures in place. Like in the HDB sector, each household is only allowed to own one property. So you can't really speculate in the HDB sector very well, because you only entitled to own one property there. And that applies throughout the entire HDB space. And in the private sector, well, speculation has its benefits. It reviews the market price. But because in the last 15 years, as Singapore became a global city, with all this inflow of foreign capital, which was driving up the private housing market prices. And that was when the government stepped in with additional buyer's stamp duty. So it is the additional buyer's stamp duty is an additional tax for buyers and differ according to the citizenship, whether you're a permanent resident or you're a foreigner. So any foreigner buying property in Singapore will have to buy in the private housing space, and the tax is 20% for foreigners. It is very hefty, including to the usual stamp duties that they have to pay. So the transaction cost of speculation becomes very high. So this was only introduced in the past decade because of the inflow of foreign capital.
Mhm.
I think Sock-Yong, can I just remind me to just mention what I did in HDB. You see, in our public housing, we also allow people to sell the homes into the secondary market to people who would be qualified to buy the public housing. But we also, I was again advised by my colleagues to say that, because on the one hand, our government wanted to make sure that the property values doesn't drop, because if you drop, it actually create a loss of confidence among the citizens, among the businessmen. But we also did not want the inflation to go too fast, because if you do that, you price the housing costs out of the ability of the people. So one of my jobs when I was in HDB was to talk to our estate officers to fine-tune the supply and demand balance. So we closely watch the demand for public housing on a weekly basis, and then closely work out our building program to make sure that the amount of building that we build and push into the market is always like 0.5% to 1% above the demand. Because if you maintain 0.5%, 1%, first of all, you remove the inflation. At the same time, you also prevent the drop on the property value. It's a fine tune of not dropping, neither inflation. And because Singapore government applied the similar technique to private sector, when the government felt that there was a shortage of housing coming, then they will release more government land in a private market for people to build, so that the supply and demand again is kept into a better balance. And that's why we did not have much issue at all with that. In recent years, for some reason, I don't know, the balance is not done as well as we used to do. So property value nowadays goes up and down a little bit more noticeable than before.
Okay, okay. I'd love to bring Senator Chang in at this point. We've been learning so much about what you've created in Singapore and how it works. And Senator Chang actually sort of instigated or wrote an essay for us at the very beginning of the year that was called "Singapore Makes Housing Work. Can Hawaii Do the Same?" You can find that on our website. That ran on January 10th of this year. And Senator Chang has introduced for the last couple of years legislation for the Aloha Homes proposal, which is modeled off much of what you've done in Singapore. So Senator Chang, I would love to invite you to tell the viewers a little bit about the Aloha Homes proposal and where it currently stands in this session of the legislature.
Thanks, Julia. And it's just been such a privilege to hear from our two experts from Singapore this afternoon and morning their time. So to answer your second question first, the legislature has considered Aloha Homes bills for the last 3 years. And unfortunately, the current version of the bill, SB 1, did not get a hearing in the House, so it is dead for this session. But the reason, the underlying principles of the plan come from this really extraordinary experience that Dr. Liu and Professor Phang have been talking about, because the truth is there are not that many jurisdictions in the world that have gone from housing shortage to housing surplus. Many of the jurisdictions that we think about, like the Bay Area of California, like London, like New York City, have had housing shortages for many, many years. And of course, Hawaii is one of those too. And the remarkable thing about Singapore that has already been extensively discussed is that the political leadership made the decision, whether consciously or unconsciously, to ensure that every Singaporean would have a home. Every Singaporean would have a home. In Hawaii today, a statistic that I often cite is that we'll have about 11,000 graduates of public school, the DOE system, this year. That's not even counting private schools. We will only have about 2,000 new housing units produced this year. So no matter how you cut it, 11,000 people will not fit into 2,000 housing units. And so Singapore had that commitment since the 1960s to ensure that every single Singaporean, every child, every grandchild, every future generation would be able to have a home. And as Dr. Liu, eloquently pointed out, this model has undergone a lot of change. The CPF savings program didn't start until 1968, after the HDB building boom was already, in full swing. The ethnic integration measures, have changed significantly over the years. The resale of the units, the policies governing what percentage of the profit you can keep, that has changed over the years. And so I believe that, as long as we're willing to learn from our mistakes and really to put on that hat that Dr. Liu was talking about of, constantly seeking to improve, even if we don't get it right here the first time, we can improve our model. And so I would suggest that, well, one of the stories that I heard a lot in Singapore was that originally they were building these 10-story apartment buildings with no elevator. And people were expected to walk up and down the stairs 10 stories back in the 1960s. As time went on, the government installed elevators, but then they would stop only at every other floor. And so you would have to walk up or down a flight of stairs if you were not on a floor that the elevator stopped. And then as more years went by, they introduced elevators that stopped on every single floor. And that just is, one illustration of how the system has improved to take into account feedback, resident needs over the years. And I think in Hawaii, as long as we make that initial commitment to building enough housing to meet demand and then not stopping, we continue to build. As Dr. Liu mentioned, he's built 20 new towns, each with 200,000 residents. And unfortunately in Hawaii, I haven't heard anyone say we are actually going to build enough to meet demand. We are actually going to build, if the study says we need 65,000 units by 2025, we will actually build 65,000 units by 2025. And so I guess, what we're seeking to do is to introduce this commitment and then to improve it and to tweak it over time, just the way that Singapore has.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a question from KC, and this gets to the whole idea of what the housing is like and how place-based and relevant it is. So Casey's question is, currently in many areas, we have a very high percentage of the houseless who are Hawaiian. Since Hawaiian culture is integrally connected with land and aina in place, putting Hawaiians in high rises would destroy culture, Casey says. Many of the Hawaiians on our coast want to remain on the land and often do some traditional farming. Do you have any suggestions for ensuring our Hawaiian families are housed and that their culture is respected and will thrive? So that's a complex question, but really getting at this, is there something, Dr. Liu, you talked about the housing that you lived in when you were a young child, and the animals were your companions, and this sort of sense of living very close to the land. And I think that in general, we tend to think that if you're living in a high rise, that's simply incompatible. So I don't know who of you would like to take that question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
That's a win moment. Can you just repeat the last sentence?
Sure.
I have a bit of hearing problem.
How does one allow for the human connection with land, which is such a fundamental part of the culture of Hawaii, when you create mass housing, which you may need for a large population? How do you bring those things together?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I mentioned that we broke down the new town into neighborhoods and to precincts. In the precinct, we have a kind of precinct center. That's for where the resident would gather. And that would be just a patch of grass with a sand pit and also some seatings arranged in a semicircle form, so that the parents can bring their kids down to play in the sand pit or some play equipment, and they sit in a semicircle space so that they can face each other and talk to each other. So we actually, through physical environment, we create, in other words, physical environment actually can dictate human behavior. So we actually, again, with the help of sociologists, all these ideas came from them to how can you create, and so not so much to dictate, is to induce a kind of neighborly behavior among the residents. But we did not stop on that. Just now I mentioned that on the upper floor, the corridors are segmentized into 6 or 8 units. And I made sure that the corridor is not a corridor. It's wider than you need as a corridor. And we call it courtyard in the sky. In other words, when you step out of a unit, you're not just in a corridor, you're actually in the community of your neighbors. In fact, if you come to Singapore to see our corridors, they plant flowers and even vegetables and put in some of their personal belongings in that. And so that it's not just a place for walking, it's a place for communication. So all these things, I would say, give people a sense of connection with each other and with the ground. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that earlier you made the point that that the planning is so essential, that you spent a lot of time and that you got a tremendous amount of input, so that I can only assume that if something similar were to be undertaken in Hawaii, it would be critical to get a large amount of input from leaders in the Hawaiian community about ways in which to make this housing truly consistent with the Hawaiian values, with the respect for the land. And so I would like to come back to you, Senator Chang, and talk to you, ask you really whether that is incorporated into your proposal, that idea. How do we make sure that this really works to enhance a sense of Hawaii rather than to create something more generic?
I guess I have two different answers to that question. And the first answer is to say that the built community of Hawaii today has fundamentally shaped who we are, our culture. And under our Aloha Homes plan, we would not demolish one single family home, one residential home of any kind. This would take place only on existing state-owned lands near rail stations in urban Honolulu, such as the Aloha Stadium parcel, for example. You know, if we are serious about preserving our, our rural way of life, like in Hanalei or like on Molokai, we would not touch that one bit. We would not develop anything outside the 0.5 mile radius of the rail stations that are being built now in urban Honolulu. Mm-hmm. The second way that I would answer that question is that actually the highly walkable, highly dense way of building, that is a very old, in fact, the original way of building, even in a place like Hawaii. So whether it's Jerusalem thousands of years ago, whether it's the medieval cities of Italy, or even if you look at downtown Honolulu, Chinatown Honolulu might be the oldest surviving neighborhood today in Hawaii. It is dense, it is highly walkable. You have the residential units upstairs, you have the retail services downstairs. Neighborhoods like this still continue to exist, even with all the suburban sprawl that we've had built here in Hawaii over the years. So in some ways, this new model of highly dense, mixed use, pedestrian-based, car-free or car-light communities, that is actually returning to the way that Hawaii has traditionally built. And that would be much better for the environment because emissions are going to be way lower. People are going to be reliant on pedestrianism, on public transportation. They won't need cars. They won't be adding to the traffic on our already congested highways. And, you know, Dr. Liu already mentioned, you know, the courtyards in the sky, the communal spaces at the ground level in Singapore are really quite interesting. You know, they will have a hawker center, which is where the whole community will come to have an inexpensive meal. And that's where you might see your neighbors multiple times a week. You know, you will have your vendor of fish, your vendor of meat. You know, you will have, there will be points in the community where people will mix and really bring about a sense of community that you might not think could exist in such high density areas.
Yeah. I want to share a comment from Dana. Singapore has far more green space per square mile than similarly densely populated cities. This is because of the vertical housing, which opens ground space for gardening and play space. Corridor greening has tremendous potential. New York, which is incredibly dense, is becoming very green, very fast. The question, and then is also, Dana also talks about this open air public ground level in the HDB buildings where people can meet and eat and play. That's the same thing you were just mentioning, Senator Chang. So the question is, can that be accomplished in Hawaii financially? How much government support would it take to create that? And what would the long-term benefits be? So do you see that as an essential component of the Aloha Homes project that you're proposing, that there's open air space, that there are these gathering places, that it's not just about apartments, it's about sort of precincts?
I would say that. I think it's, you know, the way of life that we have here in Hawaii is very special. You know, we enjoy the outdoor environment, you know, 365 days out of the year. And I think, you know, when you look at the newer HDB developments in Singapore, you really see just how much green space there is. They really take this garden city concept very seriously, not just surrounding the buildings, but actually on the buildings. We had a chance to tour the Pinnacle at Duxton project, which has parks in the sky on the 26th and 52nd floors, 52nd floors, with, you know, seating, with greenery that the community can access, even though they're on the 52nd story of a tower. They can still enjoy the natural world around them, the views, the community space.
Okay, okay.
And Julia, part of the urban planning in Singapore is about green spaces, because Singapore uses a city in a garden. And so another statutory board is very important in Singapore context is our National Parks Board. So I think there is a target to ensure that 9 out of 10 households have within 10 minutes of their home have access to a park. So there's underway all this park connectors work that is going on. And I think that goes back to the concept plan that was the master planning that is being done, not just for the HDB, but for the entire country in terms of what the citizens' preferences would be.
Yeah. Dr. Liu, I want to return to you. We've actually gone over our hour, but this has been just such a wonderful conversation. And I'd love to ask you, Dr. Liu, what are your hopes? You said that it was so many people who were involved in creating this in Singapore, and yet you were clearly a key part of it. And when you look forward to the next half century of Singapore's nationhood, and what are your hopes for the country, specifically in terms of its housing?
For Singapore or for Hawaii?
Well, both. I was thinking of Singapore, but if there's anything you would like to share with us about Hawaii and your hopes for Hawaii, we would deeply grateful to hear that.
Okay, for Singapore, I would say that we have laid a good foundation for public housing policy and methodology. So I think the Singaporeans can look forward to always having a home, either by renting or by buying them, owning them. In fact, just to show how determined our government is to make sure everybody has a home. You see, the smallest apartment we have is called the studio apartment, one-room flat, 36 square meter. So anyway, it's like 360 square feet. Now, the rental of that studio apartment, when I left in 1989 in HDB, was $24 Sing. What do you think is the rent today? Still 24 Sing. Of course, today, in those days, it was $24 Sing, just one rate. Now it's ranging from $24 to $220, depending on your income. But if you really have very low income, you can get this apartment for $24. But if you still cannot afford the $24, you can actually share the apartment with 2 other people of the same sex. So each one will pay $8 Sing per month, just to make sure you have no excuse that you can't have a home. Okay, so this is how committed we are. Yeah, but I would like to maybe take the opportunity to say that. So in Singapore, I think housing, I don't think that we need to worry. You just carry on, except that I feel that there's a tendency now to build something that's a little bit more iconic, But personally, when you go to a home, you want to go to a very simple, low-key environment, not iconic. That's one thing I have a bit of worry. But I want to come back to Hawaii. Despite the fact that my experience is high-rise housing, but I do envy going to places where the density is not so high. In fact, I have the good fortune to go to places to design very low density cities and new towns. For example, I planned a new town in Kazan, in Tatarstan, in Russia. The tallest building there is 6-story. Okay. And currently I'm doing urban planning for Suva in Fiji. And that's a super low density area. So when we plan, we must respect the lifestyle of the local, because if you don't respect it, they cannot accept your plan. So in the case of Hawaii, it's been a long time since I last went there, so I don't know the latest condition, but I imagine it will be generally low, medium rise. And low, medium rise to me, we just create a plan to make it work for low, medium rise. In fact, low, medium rise to me is better than very high, low rise, because when you have a low, medium rise project, first of all, you can create more walkable streets. But what is even more important is low, medium rise environment can support public transportation. If it's a totally low rise, it's very hard to support, to make public transportation viable. So I'm hoping that Hawaii, if you can build a low, medium rise with public transportation. And public transportation partly is to minimize the dependency on cars, save energy. But what is equally important is that with the aging population all over the world, a lot of older people are no longer able to drive. So they need to depend on buses to take them to places. So low, medium rise, I think, would help that. So if I were to, maybe I just carry on a little bit. If I haven't been to Hawaii for a long time, so I don't know the land ownership situation. I don't know the political climate there. But I feel that there's an English saying that seeing is believing. So if Hawaii should create a new town, a new town of, say, 200,000 people. But if that's too big, maybe create a neighborhood of, say, 10, 12,000 people. Within the neighborhood, you have shopping, you have schools, you have clinic, and so on. And it's a neighborhood which is a mixture of public housing as well as private housing for different income groups. Now, if we can pick a piece of land of that size and then try to develop it and show the citizens and show the government that such a thing can happen in Honolulu, I think that would be a good starting point to spread the desire or the confidence to build more housing to meet the need of the Hawaiian people. That would be one suggestion ahead. Forget about our high density. And if you can do the low, medium rise, I think that is a very good starting point. It's a better starting point than Fiji that I'm doing now, or Brunei I was doing. They're all very, very low density. I suspect Hawaii's density is a bit higher.
Yeah. I used to live in Suva, and of course it's a Pacific Island nation. And so it would be very interesting to hear about what exactly you are designing there, but we are way over our time. So perhaps you will come back and join us again. Certainly there is a huge need for all of these ideas that you're sharing with us today. the news just came out that the median house price on Oahu just hit a new record high in March of $950,000 for a single family home. So you mentioned a rent of Singaporean $24 a month, but we simply have housing where the prices are so very, very high and continue to climb all the time. And there are so many hardworking people on Oahu who just no longer have the means to afford housing. The wages and the cost of housing have become too far apart from each other for so many people. So it's very, very interesting to hear you talk about the philosophical underpinnings of housing in Singapore and the idea that it is essential, and it is recognized by the government that it is essential that everyone have a home.
Yes. And you build communities, you don't just build housing. In fact, in our new towns, how many percent of the land do you think is used for housing? 45%, less than 50%. The rest is really for facilities, roads, parks, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank all three of you so much for being with us today. I want to thank our viewers for staying with us. I want to thank them for all of their questions. Dr. Liu, we wish you so well. You just seem like you're on fire. And we haven't even talked about the things that you've done in other parts of Asia, the huge work that you've done in China. So we really think perhaps maybe we should have another conversation with you at some point in the future. Professor Pang, thank you so very much for joining us. We know you both are going to get on with your day there now. It's Thursday in Singapore. Senator Chang, thank you very much for being here and talking to us about the Aloha Homes proposal, the specifics. And to all the viewers, thank you. And please join us again for the next Ideas Live show. We'll be back on Wednesday, April 21st. To all of you, aloha. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Thank
Sock-Yong,
you.
good to see
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much for a great discussion.
Now, thank you for initiating this idea of this discussion.
It was great. Yeah,
And Julia, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Julia.
we're very honored. Thank you.